Presidential Fellows presentation this afternoon. My name is Wenxin Ye. I am professor of history and my field of specialization is modern China. I am pleased and honored to be your moderator this afternoon, introducing Professor John Lee, who is our presenter. Professor Lee is the C.K. Cho professor in sociology. Not anymore. Well, Professor Lee is our professor in sociology, and he's been at Berkeley since 2003. That is accurate. Thank you. Okay, and he's one of he has ever since his graduation from Harvard University with all of his degrees, he has been an extremely consistently productive researcher and a very prolific author of books. So he is the author of at least 9 monographed books, and including 3 which are forthcoming, respectively entitled The Consolation of Social Theory, Violence, and the Korean Diaspora. His other books are Zainichi, Diaspora, Nationalism and Post-Colonial Identity, Modern Peoplehood, Multi-Ethnic Japan, Han, Unbound, The Political Economy of South Korea, Sociology of Contemporary Japan, and then also a co-authored volume in 1995, Blue Dreams, Korean Americans and the 1982 Los Angeles riots. Now these are simply his books. In addition, he is the editor of 4 volumes. He is the author or editor or co-author of 4 instructional books. He is the author of numerous articles. He serves on at least 20 editorial boards, and he's also held visiting positions in at least over a dozen universities all around the world, including Europe, East Asia, Southeast Asia, New Zealand, for instance, and of course elsewhere in the United States, including Harvard University. So all of that, a record that he has compiled since 2003 upon his arrival at Berkeley, and certainly to the envy or embarrassment of some of his much less productive colleagues. So with that as a moderate introduction, shall we start?
Thank you for coming. What I'd like to do today is to offer a very brief conspectus, an overview of Korean diaspora, and to give you a sense of the complexity and, if you will, contradictions of human movements in recent history. Now, the concept of diaspora has become something of a buzzword or catchword in the human sciences in the past 2 decades. Before that, when people talked about diaspora, it meant a singular one, namely the Jewish diaspora. Now, what I want to say is that partially because of its etymology, the Greek etymology of scattering of seeds, diaspora has become the dominant way to describe and capture human movements in recent history, escaping the particular case of the Jewish diaspora. Now, of course, we can say that human movement is coeval, simultaneous with human history. This is certainly true whether we look at the origins of our genus, Homo sapiens, or in fact ourselves, Homo sapiens sapiens, who arose, according to physical anthropologists, some 200,000 years ago. Now, we also know that it's only in the last 100,000 years or so that human beings, modern human beings, had left the African continent. They arrived, for example, in East Asia only 30,000 years ago. Yet, of course, none of us would say, people who are of East Asian origin, that they are African Americans, just because our ancestors came 100,000 years ago from Africa. And this is because to talk about diaspora presupposes the creation of something like the modern nation state or other modern ethno-national identity. Before modern era, by and large, we find in human groups a great deal of linguistic diversity, religious diversity, and of course, cultural diversity. It's only once modern national or ethno-national identity becomes established that we can begin to recognize and discuss diaspora in our sense. And this is possible because of institutional developments like the modern state and its surveillance mechanisms of giving citizenship rights, making sure that border is controlled, and taking accounts of foreigners coming in, its co-nationals going out, and so on. So from this perspective then, it's actually very hard to talk about Korean diaspora before 19th century. If you look at popular or best-selling textbooks on modern or Korean history, you'll often find that the textbook begins 2.5 million years ago. The best-selling English language textbook actually begins in Paleolithic age, written by a Harvard professor. And yet, of course, we know that human beings didn't exist 2.5 million years ago. So how can we say even that Koreans existed? In more nationalist vein, most Korean history books begin from about 5,000 years ago. There is kind of an epithet that Koreans have 5,000 years of history. Although it's possible to, of course, write about history of the Korean peninsula, it's also very difficult to say that there was anything approaching modern Korean national identity. Right? It's only roughly in 19th century that Koreans begin to develop a sense of Koreanness. That is to say, everyone who belongs or lives in the Korean peninsula begin to perceive themselves as belonging to the Korean nation. And it's only precisely then that movements in and out of the Korean peninsula become part of the modern diaspora. So from this perspective then, I would like to argue that Korean national So I was so clever, excuse me. It is not working. Okay, great. Okay, so it's roughly in 1860s then that we can talk about the establishment of modern diaspora. In particular, the 1860 Convention of Peking allows the Korean peninsula to be contiguous with the Russian territory. And it's from this moment that we can begin to chart the exodus of ethnic Koreans into Russian territory. At the same time, in 1875, the Qing Empire in China lifts a ban on non-Manchus from living in Manchuria. And this, of course, is the time the large influx of ethnic Koreans into Manchuria begins to occur. What I like to stress, though, is that it's not as if there were no movements before. It's simply that we don't have very good records of them. And by and large, the approximate reason why ethnic Koreans began to go northward had to do with a series of agrarian famines that occurred throughout 1860s, which made their livelihood in northern Korea unbearable and unviable in many ways. So the beginning then of the real modern Korean diaspora begins then in late 19th century. And what really promotes the Korean diaspora is Japanese colonial rule that begins in 1910 officially, but it's very much part of the Korean livelihood from 1905 or so. the Russian territory becomes essentially a home for Korean nationalists and radicals who try to escape Japanese colonial rule and try to establish a home base for Korean independence movement and anti-Japanese colonial movement. At the same time, the vast majority of people who left Korea to go to Russia were essentially farmers, hunters, and gatherers who wanted to make a livelihood in what we would today call Siberia. What enabled this, of course, is the largely favorable policy that Russian and then Soviet government had toward immigrants. As you know, even today, Siberia is not populated very well. And at the time, in efforts to develop Siberia, Russian and then Soviet government wanted more migrants to come and cultivate the land in Siberia. What then turns a very motley group of political radicals and farmers and hunters in Siberia into a cohesive diaspora in Soviet Union is very much a political accident. Namely, in the context of Stalin's Great Purge in 1936, he begins to round up foreign nationals and engages in a spate of ethnic cleansing. The first ethno-national group to suffer this fate were Koreans in Siberia. And this has a lot to do with Stalin's paranoia, especially toward foreign nationals living in the Soviet Union. And in particular, at the time, ethnic Koreans were, of course, politically at least, Japanese, because they were under Japanese colonial rule. So basically, every ethnic Korean in Siberia was rounded up, taken on a train to Central Asia, largely to today's Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and so on. So almost 200,000 ethnic Koreans ended up from being rice farmers or hunters in Siberia to becoming essentially nomads and farmers in Central Asia. And this becomes a traumatic memory for Koryo Saram, as ethnic Koreans in Soviet Union or ex-Soviet Union call themselves. The forced transportation killed many of them. Living in essentially the desert and the steppes of Central Asia made livelihood very difficult. And so the history or memory of ethnic Koreans in Soviet Union or ex-Soviet Union are recounted as a result of this tragic event. And yet, curiously, in part because Soviet Union insisted on a stringent assimilationist policy, there were to be no more ethnic language schools. Koreans were supposed to be part of the Soviet Empire. One of the curious paradoxes is that many ethnic Koreans in Soviet Union became quite successful. So from the standpoint of 1960s and perhaps 1970s and 80s, one might have said that the most successful Korean diaspora in the world was actually in the Soviet Union. In the 1970s, for example, the director of Institute of Historical Studies at Moscow was an ethnic Korean. There is a very well-known Soviet writer named Anatoly Kim, who is really regarded as one of the great Soviet or Russian writers of the modern era, as well as even a rock star, Viktor Tsoi, who became perhaps the single most charismatic musician in 1980s Soviet Union. So this is another quite a paradoxical history, one of ethnic cleansing, suffering, assimilation, and yet, curiously, a great deal of success. So much so that people are tempted to call Korean diaspora in Soviet Union an instance of great success, model minority. A footnote to the Soviet Union story is ethnic Koreans in Sakhalin. They are the result of forced migration by and large by Japanese colonial government to cultivate Sakhalin, which in 1930s had become Japanese colony. And so by 1945, there were coal miners, forestry workers, and others who were then abandoned in Sakhalin at the end of war in 1945. What makes the Sakhalin case slightly curious is that one of the few diasporas from North Korea after 1945 occurred in Sakhalin as North Koreans sent workers to the island. This is a diaspora that's almost completely ignored, and we actually know very little about it. The second major effect of Japanese colonial policy was in China. As you know, Japan establishes Manchuria as a semi-autonomous colony, as Manchukuo, and tries to create a multi-ethnic or multinational polity in Manchuria. In particular, Japanese colonial government strives to make Manchuria into something of a rice basket of East Asia, particularly for Japan, but also to engage in industrial development by exploiting mines and other natural resources in Manchuria. In part from voluntary, but also in part from involuntary immigration, especially from 1940 or so, the population of ethnic Koreans in Manchuria mushroomed to something like 2.1 million in 1940. A small footnote to this diaspora is that after 1937 or so, all the nationalists or the radicals who were engaged in anti-Japanese activities shift their focus from Russia or Soviet Union to Manchuria. This is, of course, where Kim Il-sung spent his youth trying to supposedly fight Japanese colonial military in 1930s and 1940s. At the end of the war, World War II that is, in 1945, roughly half of ethnic Koreans returned to the Korean peninsula. And what's curious, though, is that over half remain. And what made them stay in large part had to do with the establishment of New China, or the People's Republic of China. There are two things about People's Republic of China that are important for encouraging ethnic Koreans to stay. One is its relatively egalitarian policy, namely, most importantly, land reform, which allowed ethnic Koreans to cultivate farmland. You have to remember the vast majority, probably over 90%, were farmers who were essentially interested in just becoming farmers, having plots of land to cultivate. Second, and just as important, was PRC's pro-minority culture policy. In particular, from 1955, Yanbian, as it became to be known, present-day Jilin province, becomes a culturally autonomous zone for Koreans. And one of the things that characterizes the Korean diaspora in China is the sheer concentration of population in a small region, in Jilin province, and at the same time, the persistence of language and culture of Koreans. So even today, even though the population had become quite dispersed, even though PRC doesn't have such a favorable minority cultural policy, the extent of Korean language use in Jilin province is quite phenomenal. Whereas in Russia, you will not find Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, it's almost impossible to find any ethnic Koreans who speak Korean. Many of them can even say hello or thank you. You'll find that the majority can still speak at least conversational Korean in China. The strength, although of cultural and linguistic group, however, begins to wither away from roughly 1980s, and especially after 1992. With the combination of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, as well as Chinese government's desire to weaken the solidarity of ethnic groups throughout China, not just Koreans, but also Tibetans, Mongolians, and so on, you'll find the attenuation of concentration of ethnic groups. And surely many of the ethnic Koreans have begun to disperse to large cities, anywhere from Dalian, Beijing, to Qingdao. At the same time, because of normalization treaty with South Korea after 1992, there's an incentive for ethnic Koreans, who are Korean speakers, as I mentioned, to work, get married, and live in South Korea, which by then had become quite wealthy and dynamic economy. There is yet a third major group that arises out of Japanese colonial rule, and that is, of course, the establishment of ethnic Koreans in Japan. At the beginning of colonial rule in 1910, there were perhaps 4,000 ethnic Koreans or Korean nationals. But by 1940, something like 2 million ethnic Koreans lived in the main Japanese islands. And they came largely as voluntary labor migrants at first, and from very late 1930s as enforced labor migrants working in coal mines, becoming wartime comfort women, and so on and on. At the end of the war in 1945, roughly 2/3 returned to the Korean Peninsula, and yet 1/3 stays. And you might wonder why that is. And the simple reason is that people who came in the 1920s and 30s had become, for lack of better words, acculturated to Japanese way of life. Many of their children could only speak Japanese, and this, of course, in the context that even in Korean Peninsula proper, Japanese was the only language of instruction in schools. Japan, of course, was a relatively peaceful and also more prosperous country, and as ethnic Koreans waited for the motherland or fatherland to unify, many of them stayed in Japan. What's interesting about the Korean diaspora in Japan is the systematic disrecognition, that is to say, exclusion or almost apartheid that the Japanese government practiced against ethnic Korean group. At the same time, Koreans began to be assimilated or acculturated into Japanese way of life. So we have a very paradoxical situation in which ethnic Koreans in Japan by 1970s could only really make a living in Japan proper, and yet there was a formal and insistent discrimination against the Korean population. That is to say, ethnic Koreans could not become teachers, government officials, and only in the 1980s could become lawyers and so on. What is very paradoxical, though, about this process is that even though discrimination against Korean was probably strongest in Japan, if you compare it around the world, in some very, very interesting way, ethnic Koreans in Japan became highly successful. And this has a lot to do with the fact that ethnic Koreans were excluded from formal sector employment. So many of the singing stars, music stars, entertainment stars, and sports stars in post-World War II era were ethnic Koreans. At the same time, as most Japanese people who were intelligent or hardworking sought employment in Honda, Toyota, or Sony, because ethnic Koreans could not get hired in these large companies, they became entrepreneurs. So if you look at the 25 richest Japanese in 2010, 11 of them are actually ethnic Koreans. So some people suggest that the richest ethnic Korean in Japan, or actually richest Japanese, is Masayoshi Son, who is the founder of SoftBank, who is incidentally UC Berkeley graduate. But that's the kind of success that many ethnic Japanese didn't pursue because their dream was to work for Honda or Sony and not to become an entrepreneur. So again, paradoxically, even though they're very discriminated against, many of the best-known people in Japan are actually ethnic Koreans. And one final footnote is that if you look at the realm of cultural production, say in literature, even though we can talk about efflorescence of Korean American literature in the United States, it's actually in Japan that ethnic Koreans had made their mark the most. The Akutagawa Prize, which is the most prestigious prize in Japan, had been won at least 4 times by ethnic Koreans. Whereas, as far as I know, no ethnic Korean writer in the US has won the Pulitzer Prize. So all this is a story from first half of the 20th century. What happens after 1945 when Korea becomes liberated, becomes independent? North Korea, as I mentioned very briefly, becomes largely enclosed unto itself it does send some workers, as I mentioned, to Sakhalin, and to some actually very bizarre places, anywhere from Africa to Latin America. But by and large, by 1970s, the only exodus of ethnic Koreans from North Korea is to China, often crossing the border illegally. South Korea, however, becomes a major powerhouse or major source of diaspora. And of course, this has a lot to do with its impoverished and overpopulated situation in 1950 and 1960s. In particular, South Korean government engages in a population policy not only to reduce fertility, but also to encourage immigration of ethnic Koreans abroad. So one kind of embarrassing episode in South Korean history is its effort to export babies or orphans. So some 150,000 ethnic Koreans now live across Europe, North America, and elsewhere. Just to give you a sense of how common this is, last time I went to Norway, I have a US passport, and I showed my passport, and the Norwegian man at the immigration authorities started to speak to me in Norwegian. And because I had been spending the last 12 hours studying Norwegian, I could answer him. And somehow he thought this was perfectly normal, and we parted after exchanging a few more phrases I had learned in my Norwegian in one day. The reason why this is possible is because of a surprising number of ethnic Korean babies who were, if you will, exported to Norway. So for him, it wasn't uncommon at all to see someone who looks like me speaking Norwegian, and actually even having a US passport, because that's actually a very common path for adoptees, that finding themselves slightly uncomfortable in Europe, that they would often emigrate in turn to the US later. Now, the destination of others were largely labor immigrants. The first countries that South Korean government concluded treaties with was Germany, which, as you know, from 1950s was engaged in a foreign labor policy, Gastarbeiter policy, trying to import workers from Greece, Turkey, and elsewhere. So thousands of Korean nurses and miners went to Germany. At the same time, many ethnic Koreans began to emigrate to Brazil and Argentina in the early 1960s. This becomes then a template for South Korean diaspora around the world. By 1970, South Korean government really ends its labor immigration policy, but South Koreans in turn begin to want to emigrate voluntarily. You have to remember that even then, South Korea was still a poor country with horrible working conditions, low wages, and so they went where there was a possibility of employment. And this, of course, is precisely the time many advanced and industrial countries around the world were looking for workers because they faced labor shortage. So Australia, for example, began to have a pro-Asian immigration policy in the 1970s, precisely when there were no Japanese, for example, or Chinese willing to emigrate. In the Middle East, in the 1970s, there were close to 800,000 South Koreans who worked somewhere in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and elsewhere. And even though most of them were temporary workers, we know that at the time of the revolution in Iran in 1979, there were at least 25,000 permanent residents who were of ethnic Korean origin. But the major destination for ethnic Koreans or South Koreans was to the US. And this, of course, has to do with the fact that US was the most important country for South Korea after 1945. Its largest trading partner, its main source of defense guarantee, the most ideal country for South Korean. And as you probably know, if you study US immigration history, what made South Korean dream possible was the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, the immigration reform, which ended the ban or strict limits on immigration from what we would today call the global South. What's interesting about Korean immigration to the United States is the preponderance of elites within South Korea to want to live and make their livelihood in the United States. Until 1980 or so, there were only 2 medical schools in South Korea. And like in many countries, being a medical doctor is considered to be a very prestigious occupation. One university, Yonsei, we know that from 1952 to 1985, of all the MDs that Yonsei conferred, fully half of them were in the United States by 1990. Meaning that rather than enjoying life of privilege and wealth in South Korea, these medical doctors preferred to be even a doctor and sometimes even just a merchant in the United States. So one of the secrets of the idea that Korean Americans are a model minority in the US actually has a lot to do with the sheer fact that many of the most educated, the most successful South Koreans ended up in the United States. And one curious feature of this is because they sought cultural assimilation, many of the second generation Korean Americans who became very successful are very often monolingual, meaning that they actually don't know any Korean. They did not try to pass down Korean language or culture. Of course, the situation shifts roughly from 1980 or so as the character of immigration changes from elite to increasingly middle class and over time to working class. So I realize this is a whistle-stop tour of the world, but by and large then we find that as of 2010 or so, roughly 7 million ethnic Koreans live outside the Korean Peninsula. In the Korean Peninsula, perhaps there are 70 million people, north and south combined. The largest destination still remains China, 2.5 million, US at 2 million. But below some of these countries are rapidly growing populations in Brazil, Argentina, and other countries that you would not probably normally associate with the Korean diaspora. And this has a lot to do with the fact that Korea still remains, South Korea, in spite of its wealth, in spite of its democracy, in spite of its supposed cultural coolness, a land that many people are desperate to leave. And this ranges from horrible working conditions at elite firms to the rather dysfunctional examination and educational system that exists in South Korea. Now, as a trained social scientist, I am supposed to offer you some generalizations. I actually don't think there are that many. In fact, I don't think there is any. And it has a lot to do with the fact that, yes, there are shaping forces of geopolitics, political economy, some of the particularities of South Korean society, and yet it is hard to make claims, predictions, or generalizations about the fate of different diasporic communities. Because many of the tragedies, I mentioned the Korean diaspora and its ethnic cleansing in Soviet Union, and yet, ironically or paradoxically, they became quite successful. Same with Japan. Who would have expected Koreans facing apartheid essentially for 3 decades would end up being a relatively successful minority group? So one of the lessons of diasporic studies is, in fact, that many of the urges or dreams of the social sciences actually don't work very well. At the same time, you'll find that the punchline of each national diaspora or each diasporic community actually is quite fluctuating. If I had given this lecture in 1938, I would have said that the fate of Koreans in Soviet Union were extremely dire. Similarly, if I had given this lecture in 1985 about Korean diaspora in Japan, I would have said the situation is terrible. It's one of apartheid. And yet, as I mentioned, these conclusions actually will no longer be relevant or valid in 2015. If you look at other features or predicates of diasporic communities, the language spoken, whether or not they retain Korean, how much food waste remain, what sort of cultural pride or identity they have, again, these are quite variable and are, I would argue, not explainable by simple variables. And as I mentioned, one of the curious things about South Korea is the persistence of diasporic desires. And I would suggest that one of the interesting things, if you study this sort of thing, is the future of what will happen when North Korea and South Korea converge and possibly unify. Because we have a situation whereby the two countries have become, I would argue, two distinct ethnic groups. If you look at something as simple as mean average height in the separation in the last 70 years, the difference is something like 15 centimeters or 7 inches, which is larger than most racial differences that physical anthropologists talk about. And this is not to mention a completely different ethos, inability of North Koreans to function in capitalist modernity, and so on and on. So you'll find actually that even as South and North Koreans increasingly and stridently talk about nationalism and homogeneity of Koreanness, you'll find actually that they are actually fracturing even as we speak. Thank you for your attention. Yes.
Hi. I'm familiar with Japanese case. In the case of Japan, recently